The film begins with a little child named Kyle and his mother, Rebecca, traveling to a tiny village in the United States. Kyle's first day at his new school. He bid goodbye to his mother and rode his bike to school. When he entered the classroom, the teacher greeted him and instructed him to pick a seat. Later, the teacher asked a child called Jason to present his science presentation. But when Jason tried to go up, a troublemaker named Rick purposefully tripped him. This caused Jason to tumble, ruining his science research. Unfortunately, Jason was afraid to notify the teacher because of Rick. Surprisingly, it was Kyle who informed the teacher about the occurrence. As a result, Rick was suspended for 2 days. However, Rick couldn't take the penalty, so he and his friends went to confront Jason after school, intending to injure him. Fortunately, Kyle intervened and squared off against Rick and his gang. Even though Kyle was smaller than Rick, he easily beat them. After that, Kyle left school to go home. However, Jason eagerly followed him and offered to be buddies. Kyle was initially hesitant because he was a quiet and introverted guy, but Jason persuaded him till he consented. Soon they were contacted by Rick's older brother, Jack, who was outraged when he learned Kyle had defeated Rick. Jack went to Kyle and Jason and confronted them. Rick was convinced that his older brother could easily beat Kyle and Jason. Kyle, on the other hand, skillfully stood his own, even scratching Jack's automobile. This got Jack furious, and he began chasing Kyle and Jason in his car. They attempted to flee on their bikes but were cornered by a canal. Jack first doubted Kyle and Jason's ability to cross the canal, but they bravely hopped the canal on their bikes and arrived at an airstrip. They were able to escape Jack and came upon a man named Ed, Jason's uncle who worked as a pilot and aircraft mechanic at the airport. Jason introduced Kyle to Ed, who inquired whether he loved aviation. Kyle admitted that he didn't know because he had never been on one. When Ed heard this, he kindly asked Kyle and Jason to board a tiny plane and take them on a thrilling journey across the skies. Kyle and Jason thoroughly enjoyed their flight. Later, Ed dropped them off at Jason's place. Kyle was introduced to Jason's active family, which was very different from Kyle's position, as he resided with his mother in a hotel. Jason also introduced Kyle to his ailing grandfather, Jansen, who proudly revealed that he used to be a decorated U.S. military pilot. Later, Jason and his mother took Kyle to his residence. Kyle lied, claiming to reside in a luxury house, but when Jason and his mother departed, Kyle returned to the hotel where he and his mother were staying. Kyle and Jason met up again the next day. They were both fascinated by the concept of flying, so they returned to the location where they could view the planes. This time, Jason took a walkie-talkie to keep them in touch as they went plane watching. They went into a hangar and saw a much larger plane than the rest. Initially, they were simply interested and chose to examine the jet by going inside, but things took an unexpected turn when many people entered the hangar and boarded it. Kyle and Jason fled to the plane's cargo hold, fearing they would be apprehended. A little later, the plane began to move, leaving the hangar and taking off into the sky. After some time, the plane arrived at an airport. Meanwhile, a group of men arrived and carried bags that appeared to contain money on board the plane. Afterward, the plane lifted off again, leaving the airport behind. Kyle and Jason became hungry during their flight. They began looking for food and decided to open one of the bags they'd noticed earlier. The bag did not contain food, instead it packed a bomb. Kyle and Jason were scared by what they discovered. They desperately tried to inform the pilot and swiftly exited the cargo hold. Surprisingly, they discovered that the plane was flying without a pilot, leaving them with little alternative but to take control of the plane, although having never flown an aircraft before. In the excitement of the moment, Kyle was unclear what to do with the explosives. Jason, who was in the cockpit, instructed Kyle to drop the bomb. Kyle immediately followed Jason's command, and the bomb landed on a farmer's house, resulting in a massive explosion that demolished it. After dealing with the bomb, Kyle assisted Jason in flying the plane. They did their best to avoid colliding with anything or hitting a mountain. After a while in the air, the plane ran out of fuel, forcing them to make an emergency landing on a road. Kyle and Jason worked hard to ensure that the jet landed safely and without causing any harm to anyone. They eventually managed to land the jet safely. Meanwhile, Ed was observed in the cafe where Rebecca works. Both were taken away by the story of Kyle and Jason's dramatic landing, garnering them the moniker the Sky Kids. Since that incredible episode, Kyle and Jason have become local celebrities and the buzz of the town. Their newfound celebrity attracted the attention of a man named Angelo, who turned out to be the owner of the jet and the bomb-laden luggage. At the same time, two males named Lenny and Silvio were concerned as they watched the news about Kyle and Jason, who were the ones who planted the bomb on the plane. Lenny and Silvio were Angelo's henchmen, but they attempted to betray and hurt him. However, Kyle and Jason unwittingly ruined their plan. The next day, as Jason and Kyle arrived to school as usual, Jack reappeared and seemed determined to face them. However, at that point, two people pretending to be FBI agents arrived and urged Kyle and Jason to accompany them. Remembering their prior fear of Jack, they opted to work with these alleged agents. After a long trek, Kyle and Jason discovered that the alleged FBI agents were actually Angelo's henchmen. However, these two men assured them that their employer would not harm Kyle or Jason. When Kyle and Jason arrived at Angelo's house, they were brought into a room packed with video games and toy firearms. When Angelo's henchmen left, Kyle and Jason grabbed toy pistols and began playing. Meanwhile, Angelo watched Kyle and Jason from behind a glass wall, reflecting on his own childhood memories with Silvio. Surprisingly, these memories were very similar to Kyle and Jason's adventures. Angelo eventually decided to engage in the game with them, bringing two toy weapons. After they had had their fill of fun, Angelo asked Silvio and Lenny to take Kyle and Jason home. He also gave them a bag of food for their travel. While they were traveling, Jason took out his walkie-talkie and turned it on. They realized Lenny had another walkie-talkie with him. This statement made Kyle and Jason realize that these two individuals were the ones who planted the bomb in the plane. Lenny also felt frightened, fearing Kyle and Jason might report their behavior to Angelo. This uncomfortable scenario resulted in a furious argument between Lenny and Silvio. Lenny eventually consented to Silvio's idea of pulling over and taking a break to calm down. Silvio, who had known Angelo since boyhood, sought to explain to Lenny that being honest might result in Angelo's forgiveness. Unfortunately, Lenny refused to listen and shot Silvio. Kyle and Jason are terrified after seeing this startling deed and chose to flee for their own safety. Lenny pursued them and fired shots along the way. Meanwhile, as Silvio approached the end of his life, he longed to tell Angelo what had happened. Sadly, Silvio died before he could explain everything. On another front, Lenny, who had been pursuing Kyle and Jason for quite some time, eventually apprehended Kyle and took him to a hangar. When they arrived, they met Ed, and Lenny forced him to fly the plane. Ed was initially eager to comply with Lenny as long as Kyle was free, but Lenny threatened to harm them both. Around the same time, Jason arrived at the hangar and discovered Kyle was in dire danger. Jason bravely pursued the plane and managed to get inside. This action notified Ed that Kyle and Jason were in trouble. Kyle and Jason glared at Lenny as the jet took off. This infuriated Lenny, and he attempted to subdue them. Fortunately, Ed interfered by tilting the plane, foiling Lenny's plans. Lenny, feeling confined, tried to shoot Ed but failed. Ed stepped up from his seat and attempted to approach Lenny, while Jason quickly took over Ed's job as pilot. As Jason continued to steer the jet, Ed felt pressured by Lenny to divert his attention. Kyle hurled the money he had taken from Angelo, which enraged Lenny, and he shot Kyle, causing him to fall from the plane. Seeing this, Ed and Jason dashed after Kyle to save him. Ed, gripping his parachute, strained to grab Kyle and Jason's hands. After a few attempts, Ed was able to catch them. Ed quickly deployed his parachute, and they landed safely. Meanwhile, Angelo got aware of Kyle and Jason's plight and began searching for them using a helicopter. He eventually found Kyle, Jason, and Ed shortly after they landed. Kyle and Jason then informed Angelo that Lenny had slain Silvio while attempting to save them. Angelo appeared very upset by Silvio's untimely death, but he couldn't do anything about Lenny, who was still on the plane. Unfortunately, Lenny lost control of the jet and crashed into a hill, exploding on impact. After that, Angelo returned the three of them to their homes. Upon arriving, Kyle and Jason apologized for the plane incident. However, Angelo told them that the plane and money were less important than their safety. He even offered Ed a job as a private pilot, but he declined, pleased with his current position as a mechanic. Later, Ed took Kyle and Jason to Jason's home. He begged that they not notify their parents about the recent happenings. Kyle acknowledged to Jason after Ed left that he lived in a hotel rather than the luxurious property he had shown them. Kyle was pleased and relieved that Jason did not mind. When Kyle arrived home, Jason entered his home to a warm welcome from his entire family. Jason's grandfather, who had been impatiently waiting, was filled with satisfaction when he saw the newspaper report about Kyle and Jason successfully salvaging the jet. Jason's granddad gave Jason one of his medals as a mark of appreciation. Meanwhile, Rebecca stayed at Kyle's side as he slept, beaming with pride at what Kyle and Jason had accomplished in saving the airliner. Later, Angelo told his thugs to deal with Jack, so he wouldn't disturb Kyle and Jason anymore. On the other hand, Ed, Jason, Kyle, and his mother were walking about the hangar when some of Angelo's thugs approached him. At first, he assumed they were going to give him a pilot position, which he would have declined. But to his surprise, they gave Ed the flying plane. Ed eventually took Kyle, Jason, and Rebecca on a flight aboard his new jet, which marked the end of the Sky Kids movie. The moral of this story is, don't open unusual bags on a plane. They can contain an unexpected adventure rather than snacks.